Okay. All right. How can you turn that up? Up. Is that good, Alice? Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, everyone. Is everyone doing good tonight? Good. You guys are the hardy ones. Illness is taking over rampantly everywhere. So yeah. So I'm glad that you guys are all here tonight. So pull out your observation worksheets, chapter 5, 6, 7 of Hebrews, and we're going to just carry on with what we've been talking about. So let me ask you, last week, as we were looking at the end of chapter 5, what was the condition that the author addresses at the end of chapter 5, starting, well, in verse 10, basically? Well, he starts this discussion about how he wants to tell them more about Christ's priesthood, right? Starting around verse 6 of chapter 5. And he goes through all of this about Christ offering up himself in the days of his flesh and all of these kind of things. And then he's talking about, in verse 10, he says that Christ has been designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And it's like, can you just imagine, he's just talking, he's thinking, he's writing, he's thinking, and then he says order of Melchizedek, and it's just like, whoa. And then what does he say in regards to their understanding about what he's going to try to tell them? What's going to be the problem? Yeah, they're too immature to understand what he's going to say, right? So now, does immature mean that they're not saved? No. So what does immature mean here when he says that they have become dull of hearing? What does that mean?
They're tired of learning more.
Yeah, they've come to this place where they've decided that they know everything they need to know and they're not going to learn anything else, right? And they basically have come to a place where they have become intellectually lazy. They don't want to think any deep thoughts. They don't want to learn any more information. They have the basics of their salvation down and they understand those, and that's all they need to get to heaven, right? And what is the danger of that?
Stagnant.
You grow stagnant. And he says that they should be able, by this time, and by as long as they've been believers, they should be able to do what? Teach others. But because of this stagnation, they're going to need what again themselves?
Teaching.
They're going to need to have someone come in and teach them again. And he says that this condition is the condition of babes, right? Not even toddlers. He says because he says, you have come to need milk again, right? And so he tells them that this is not a good place for them to be, that they should be growing up and eating what kind of food?
Meat.
Solid food. They should be eating meat now, right? And they, even if they may not be ready for steak, at least they should be able to be eating green beans and mashed potatoes and that kind of thing. And so what did we learn about this last week in regards to us today? Is this a warning that we need to be aware of? Yes. So what should all of us conscientiously and being determined to do, what should we all be doing?
Keep going to Thursday night Bible studies.
That's it. That was it. Yes, progressing, okay? And learning and doing all of these kind of things. Because he says if you don't do this, at the end of chapter 5 and verse 14, he says if you don't develop this skill, and remember we talked about this, that he uses all of this exercise language, right? If they don't do this, what's going to happen?
Unable to discern good and evil.
They can't discern what's good and what's wrong, or what's good and what's bad. And is that the place that all of us as Christians want to be, where we can discern, we can understand what's good and what's bad?
Yes.
Okay? And Glenn and I were just talking, and you know what, if there was ever a time, and I know that every generation, Kid and I talk about this because he'll say, oh, I think this is the worst generation, these are the worst times that have ever come, all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, yeah, that's what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, to don't look back at the good old days and say, this is the worst that it's ever been. Because every generation feels that way about something that's happening in their life. But what do we need in the midst of all of this turmoil? Like when you're having a discussion with your friends about what's happening in our nation or what's happening in the world, what is it as Christians that we desperately need? We need discernment. We need discernment. And so the author, he starts telling them then in chapter 6 that they're not going to lay a foundation again of all of these basic teachings. And last week we saw that all of these basic teachings could very easily be about what religious system? Judaism, right? Now, remember the audience, right? Primarily Jews. So he says, we're not going to go back and we're not going to lay a foundation of all of these things, looking back. And then he changes the tone for a little bit. And who does he start talking about in verse 4 of chapter 6?
Those who fall.
The those, right? Okay, so explain to me what we came up with last week about the those. Okay, something has happened right now. Have they had a full experience of Christianity? Yes, they've had a taste of Christianity. They've even been sharers in things that the Spirit has done. They've even been sharers in the Word of God. They've been sharers and they've been tasting this and doing, but then for some reason, they decide to go back, to take that divergent path, right? And last week, we talked about what is possibly the divergent path, and I think we're going to see this more as we look at chapter 6. What is the possible divergent path that they're taking? They're trying to slip back into Judaism, right? Because if they slip back into Judaism, what could they falsely tell themselves? We're good. We're still worshiping Yahweh. We've still got the sacrifices and the temple and all of that kind of thing to help us in that worship of God. We're good. We can just go back and do what we've been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we'll be good.
We get our families and our community back
Right.
too.
We get our families back, we get our community back. We just kind of have a total reset, and we get to just go back to what was okay. We don't have to have this struggle socially. We don't have to be persecuted religiously. We don't have to do any of that. And we're still good. I think this is important for the thought prospect. We're still good with God. Because as a Jew, we're still good with God because of everything we have. And what does the author say? You can't do it. You cannot do it. Because in doing that, what are they, basically their life is witnessing to what every day about Christ? That he's not who he said he was, that he's not the Messiah, that he's not the only way. And so he says that they crucify and they put Christ to open shame all the time when they live in this way, right? So, did you guys have some time to think about that? Did it make sense the more that you thought about it? Or did you walk out last week and go, phew, I'm so glad that's not me. Move on.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, and I think that as we go back to chapter 6 and we look at this more, I think it is this idea that the Jews were in a unique place, that they had the ability to just slide back into something that they thought was going to work still. Now, what's really sad about this is little did they know that a few years from when this letter was written, the temple would be gone, the sacrificial system would be gone, the priesthood would be scattered. Everything that they thought would make them right with Yahweh would be taken away from them. Right? So, in verse 9 then of chapter 6, where we're going to start tonight, how does the author make his transition back?
says that he knows that they're not in this place.
Okay,
They're
and
doing
how
better.
does he address them?
Beloved.
Beloved. Okay, and so he says, but beloved, we are convinced of better things concerning you, and things that accompany salvation, though we are speaking in this way. For God is not unjust so as to forget your work and love which you have shown towards his name in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints. Right? So he makes that turn, and what does he basically say about verses 4 through 8? Was he talking to them? Not really. Now, but he is trying to explain to them maybe why some people have left, why they're not seeing these people around anymore, all of that kind of thing. But he says, but we're convinced of better things concerning you and the things that accompany salvation. So what is he saying? That they're convinced about their profession of faith. Does the author believe that they've had a true profession of faith? Yes. But it's still what? Weak. Right? They're still spiritually immature. But he says, but we believe that we're totally convinced, we're sure of, that you have had that profession of faith. Now, what does he put forward to them as he's writing to them as proof that they have had a valid experience with Christ? Is there something that they're doing that is seen as an outcome of that faith?
Their work and the love.
They're working their love towards who?
His name.
Towards the saints. Okay? Now, it's really interesting how he writes this, because this answers the question why he's convinced. If they're spiritually immature, what has convinced the author and what has convinced him is how they're treating one another. So he says, for God is not unjust so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown. Now it's interesting. He doesn't first of all say towards your brothers and sisters in Christ. He says towards who?
God.
Towards God. So what is the author saying? That any time that these believers do something out of love and kindness to help a brother or sister Christian, what is it ultimately? In the first, it's a show of love towards who? Towards God. Right? And he says, in having ministered and is still ministering to the saints. Now, he says, is this an important component of who we are as Christians?
Yes.
It is, because if we were to look at this group of people purely on what they knew about theology and doctrine, what do we know about them? They're immature. They're just babies regarding those kind of things. But there's something that's taken hold, and because of how they're acting towards one another, the author says, we know that you have truly been saved. So let me ask you, does this kind of principle still apply today? Yeah. And what is the responsibility of believers in caring for other believers? Do we have a responsibility to do that?
Yes.
Yes. Now, do we just do it as a responsibility that, oh, we're told to take care of the poor, oh, we've got to take care of the widows, you know, that kind of thing? Why do we do it? Love. First and foremost, for who?
God.
For God, and then that love pours out to these other people, right? But I think it's a really interesting thing that the author brings up here too about God's justice. Because what did he say basically in verses 4 through 8? If those people can never be brought back to repentance, if they can never come into salvation because of what they have done, is God justly judging their unbelief? Okay? And so he's already kind of put forward this discussion of God's justice in judging those who are in verses 4 through 8. But the author says, but on the flip side of it, God is not unjust so as to not pay attention to what you're doing. Right? So what does this tell us about God when he sees his people caring for each other like this? Is this something that he takes notice of? Yes. And what kind of act does he say it is? Is it a just act? Because if he's not so unjust as to not notice it, it's just when he does notice it, right? So one of the first things that the author wants them to remember, kind of after he's given them that really heavy warning, right, is that he wants them to understand that God will not forget what they have done or are doing, right? That their consistency is seen by God, their love towards one another is seen by God, and they can grow in their theology. But what we see here is that he says, just carry on doing what you're doing, right? Now, do you find this encouraging? It is encouraging, right? And do we think of this, though, now very often as a sign of true belief when someone has this kind of compassion towards other believers? Do we see it as a sign of loving God a lot of times? I hope we do, right? That we don't see these kind of actions as self-serving, but we see them in the way that they're put forward as a true act of love. So what does he encourage them with in verse 11? What does he want them to do now? He says, and we desire that each of you show the same diligence. Same diligence as what?
It's not being dull of hearing?
Well, what does he just encourage them that they've been really good about doing?
Loving each other.
Loving one another and helping one another, right? So they've been really diligent in that. So that's where the comparison is, right? So he says, and we desire that each of you show the same diligence that you've been showing in these things, so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end. Now, what is the full assurance of hope? Because he's going to use this word hope a lot. He's going to talk about this assurance of hope. This is going to pretty much be kind of a running theme through the book from this point on. So what is it if something is full here? When you read that full assurance of hope, what does the word full carry for you? What does it bring to mind? Yeah, it carries with it a completeness, an abundance of something. It's not lacking in anything, but it's the idea of a most certain confidence, so right, that assurance that there's nothing lacking in your confidence of this, right? That's what full assurance means. But what's interesting is the word hope, and we've talked about this before, and in the New Testament, how is the word hope used? What is it? What does it mean? Because if I tell you something, all right, so, if I were to come in and tell you, you know what, I hope I get to go on a trip this summer, right? My hope is that I get to go here and I get to do this and I get to do that. When I use the word hope in connection with that narrative, what could you possibly take it as?
That you're wishing.
I'm wishing to, I'm wanting to go, okay? There's not a confidence necessarily in it. It's more of just like an idea, a wish, I'm hoping that I'm gonna go, right? That's not the way the word is used in the New Testament, right? In the New Testament, the word hope is always a confident expectation of an outcome, right? It is a joyful and confident expectation and is most often used in connection to eternal salvation. So what you see here is that when the authors in the New Testament say, well, I hope that, they're not saying, well, I'm wishing that I get to go to heaven, or I'm wishing that I get to do this, but we really don't know. No, they're saying this is a confident expectation that we understand will come about, right? There's none of this kind of thing, right? So when he says that he wishes that they would have the same diligence as they've been putting forth to show love and care for one another, that they would have the same diligence to realize the full assurance of their hope until the end, What is it that he's encouraging them to do? In a sense, endure to the end. Don't think that, well, you know what, maybe Christ is coming back, maybe he's not coming back, I don't know, maybe we're this or maybe that. He's like, no, you have an abundance of confident expectation in the truth and the validity of the things that you believed. So hold on to those until the end. And when is the end? When Christ returns, or they die and are with him. Right? Now, if they will do this, right, if they will realize the full assurance of their hope, what will happen in regards to verse 12? Because what's the problem in verse 12, does he say again? And you will not be sluggish. Sluggish is the same word as dull in chapter earlier. Right? So if they would put the same diligence into understanding this confident expectation they have, then that's going to do away with this sluggishness, this dullness of learning, this lack of intellectual curiosity about the gospel, about Christ, about who they are, how they live it out in the world, all of that kind of thing. And he says, so don't be sluggish, don't be dull like they were told not to be, but he says they will be the imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit promises. Now, there's a lot here in this verse. So, he contrasts being sluggish to being an imitator, right? So, if you could think of someone who just, you're encouraging them to do something and they're sitting on their couch going, no, I know enough to get by, I don't need to know anymore, right? He says, don't be that way. Get up and imitate someone as an example. Now, what's the difference between imitating someone and following someone? Because he doesn't say follow. He says to imitate.
Well, imitation is to copy something, like a parrot would repeat after something with the same
Yes.
tone of voice, the same way of.
Right. Right. It means, in a sense, to mimic.
Yeah.
Right? So we were talking about this last week. Someone asked me why we don't have our kids in part of our little preschool class when they're getting their wiggles out, why we don't have them sing the song Father Abraham. And I said, because that song goes sideways really fast. Because what are the kids doing the whole time in that song? If you know the song, it's like they sing, and then it's like, raise your right hand, they're all raising their right hand, then they're raising their left hands, then they're stomping their feet, then they're twirling around, then they're doing all this kind of stuff. And they love it because they're imitating. They're imitating the teacher in front of them. So is the author of the book saying, I just want you to kind of follow along. That's going to help in this dullness of learning, in this sluggishness. If you just kind of follow along behind somebody, is that going to help?
No.
No. They have to imitate. And he makes it very clear that there are two things that they need to imitate. They need to imitate faith, and they need to imitate patience. Now, how would you explain the word faith to someone? Or maybe what's another word that we could use instead of faith?
Belief or trust.
Trust, right? Faith is trust, right? So he says that you're just not going to follow behind someone who has trusted. You're actually going to imitate their what? Their trust. And you're going to imitate their patience. And what's really interesting about this word in the Greek is the word macrothumia. And macrothumia has to do with long suffering or enduring circumstances. There's another word that talks about patience in relationships, but that's not this word. And so the author is saying, you're going to find somebody, right? Because we want you to put the same diligence into growing up that you do to caring for each other. And so you're gonna find somebody and you're gonna imitate them in how they live, in their trust and their patience in enduring these difficult circumstances in their life. And that's what you're gonna do. And in that doing, you're gonna inherit the promises. Right? Now, what is a promise? I always think that's a really interesting question because the Bible talks a lot about promises. So when you read the word promise, what do you think a promise is? How do you understand that word?
Something that's not yet been fulfilled, but is going to be at some point.
It's a guarantee.
Okay?
It's a guarantee.
Okay. Now, as we do promises, is it always a guarantee?
No.
Not us, but God.
Okay, see, this is the thing about the word promise here. See, because the idea, how the word is used here in the Greek, is the undertaking of to do or to give something. It's a gift graciously given by grace, right? Not a pledge secured by negotiation. Do you see the difference? Yeah, one is a promise, the other is a treaty. Right? If I have a pledge from someone that I've secured through negotiation, then what it is that each party has a responsibility in it. They have to live within the boundary of that negotiation. They have to do all of that, but that's not a promise. A promise is usually something that is gifted to someone. It's something that's done out of grace many times, right? And so this is the idea, but it is an undertaking to do something for someone. And it's like, you know, I always think it's so interesting, you know, with children. Have you ever noticed how many times when you tell a child you'll do something, at some point in time they'll say, "Do you promise?" And at that moment, what are they asking you?
Can I trust you?
Can I trust you to
what you
do
said.
what you have told me to do that wasn't based on a negotiation or anything like that? It's just something that you told me that you will do for me. Can I trust you that you will do it? Right? And this is what's so beautiful about this idea of promises. Because when we go back to verse 12 of chapter 6, well, let's go back to 11. He says, "And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." Now, it's interesting too because he uses the word inherit, which carries a whole understanding in and of itself right there. Who is authorized to inherit something? Children or family members or something like that. The idea of having an inheritance carries with it that you're an heir, that you have the right of possession, right? So the author's putting forward all of these things, and so then, as he's looking at this, and it's really interesting because what he tells them is that you're going to make a decision to be imitators of someone who've done this, and it's going to have a permanent result in your life. So the imitation isn't just for a season, it isn't just for a moment, it's something that's going to become a habit with you, and it's going to have a permanent result in your life. And then who does he bring in as the person that we know that is held up in all throughout the New Testament as the person who's supposed to be imitated when it comes to faith in God? Abraham. Okay? Now, so because he says in verse 13, he says, "For when God made the promise to Abraham," right now, he's talking about a specific promise here, but we're gonna look at Abraham's life in a minute, but he's talking about a specific promise to Abraham. Since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you. And so having patiently waited, Abraham obtained the promise. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation is an end to every dispute. In the same way, desiring even more to show the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. Right, so let's unpack this a little bit. When he says that he swore to him, and then he brings about this idea of an oath, when you hear the word oath, how do you interpret that? Okay, as a covenant, because we know in the Bible that sometimes there were oaths with the covenant, right?
It's usually a one-way promise.
Okay, well, but that's not how the author describes an oath, right? He says that men have oaths. He goes in verse 16, for men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given, right? So it's interesting because this idea of oath is going to be through chapter 7, through chapter 8, and on in. The word here for agree is really an interesting word because it means a fence or an enclosure, that which retains something. Okay, so an oath is the perimeter of an agreement. It's what holds the agreement together.
Would that be like collateral?
Like what?
Collateral?
In a sense, because in Deuteronomy, we were told that if you took collateral with an oath, that sometimes taking an oath would have a collateral to it. But what's interesting about this, when I was looking at this, is that there are guidelines and parameters around an oath because the oath fences in a sense, both parties. That they live by this oath. And what the author reminds them of is that according to the seriousness of the oath, what will men do many times is they make oaths to show their honesty or to show the intent of the oath or whatever. Who do they call in as a witness? Now, what's interesting, the author doesn't say necessarily God, but he says that they, for men swear by one greater than themselves, right? And I think what's interesting about this is that we see this a lot when you see, when you see kids, fighting about something and then you hear, the invoking of, I swear on my grandma's grave, right? Who are they invoking at that moment to kind of be the overseer of their oath or their whatever they're talking about? Grandma, right? Or the idea of, on the lives of my children, I swear to you, right? I understand that the lives of their children are greater than their own life even. But this is also a lot of times when people really want you to understand that they're telling you the truth. They swear, as God is my witness, I'm telling you the truth, right? So this idea of having an oath and then invoking someone greater to kind of oversee the oath, the invoking of the greater shows the intention of honesty and should produce trust in the other party, and then the dispute is settled. Right? So now this was part of common practice in the making of contracts at that point in time, of going into things that there were oaths, and like Alice was saying, you'll see this when you study covenant. You'll see certain oaths, like Jacob and Laban have an oath between them that neither one of them will cross that boundary to do harm to either one of them after Jacob leaves Laban. So an oath is something that you see a lot of times being put onto an agreement. But going back to these verses, it says that in verse 13, when God made the promise to Abraham. Now, the promise here that he's talking about, we're going to look at the life of Abraham. There are a lot of things that God tells Abraham, but this particular quote in verse 14 is from chapter 22 of Genesis, after Abraham has willingly sacrificed, is willing to sacrifice Isaac, right? And what does the author say that God did purely for Abraham's benefit?
Bless you and multiply you.
Yeah, but it's not just because he wants Abraham to understand how much God has bought into this relationship and how much he's bought into prospering Abraham. God gives what to Abraham so Abraham understands God's seriousness towards him.
He swears by himself.
He swears by himself. He gives an oath where he is the guarantor that everything that he has said to Abraham will come true. So he's not just the guarantor of everything, but he also invokes his own name as a means for Abraham to trust what God is telling him. And I think that this is so interesting because we do this in a way ourselves. But what I think is really interesting is in verse 17, when the author says, in the same way God, desiring even more to show the heirs of the promise, the unchangeableness of his purpose, he binds himself to Abraham with an oath. Right? Now, let's just talk a little bit for a minute about Abraham. Right? Because if Abraham is the example here of faith and patience, then maybe we should look a little bit and see what we learn about Abraham. And like I said, I was so excited to do this because in our adult education class, we thought we were going to do a short little 8-week study on Abraham, and we're not finished yet. We might finish this next week. That's what I keep telling them every week. It's like, oh, it might be done this week. But so we've spent a lot of time looking at Abraham, and I'll tell you, it's profound, right? So turn over to chapter 12 of Genesis, and we're just gonna do kind of an overview of some of these things of the life of Abraham. The author, part of the things of why he's held up as this example to them. Okay, so in chapter 11, at the end of chapter 11, we're given all these genealogies after the flood. We're told about the Tower of Babel. We're told about that basically man was no more righteous after the flood than he was before the flood. He still is rebellious. He's all of that. But we're introduced to this family that lives in Ur, which would be, at that point in time, was kind of Mesopotamia, Babylon. And this family has left Ur, and they have come over the northern route to come down into the land of Canaan. Right? But they get to, when they're in Haran, which is part of the land in the northern before you would get into Israel, or Canaan at that time, the father, the patriarch of the family, dies. Right? And at that moment, the family has a decision to make. Are they going to go back to Ur and go back to family and live there in Ur, or what are they going to do? And it's in chapter 12 that we see God come and talk to the person who is now the patriarch of this family, and his name is Abram. And in chapter 12, what we see is how God starts this discussion and this relationship with Abram. And he says to him, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country, and that means just don't go back, right? Don't go back to Ur. And from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. Right? So the great there means increase in number, people groups. So I'm going to make you a great people group. He says, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Now, the word here in the Hebrew for blessing means to prosper or cause to prosper. So what does God promise this man? You're going to prosper, right? I'm going to cause you to prosper, and your name will be great, and the word there for great is powerful. And not only will you prosper and will you be powerful, but what will he do for others? Yeah, he will cause them to prosper as well. Right? He says, and I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you, I will curse. And the word here for curse means to make a judgment upon in a negative sense. He says, so the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. So if we wanted to put that another way, he tells this man that all of the families of the earth will prosper through you. Right? And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, at this moment, this man we've just been introduced to, he has a choice to make. Right? And what is the choice that's before him?
To continue forward or to go back?
That's right. To follow, to continue forward and go to the land that this God is telling him about, or to pack up and go home. And what does this man decide to do? He goes, right? So it says, so Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Okay, now, do you see something unique here? Do you see any anger or judgment or God telling Abraham, and you better not do that? Do you see any of that in this exchange? No. How is it framed? I want to bless you. I want to do things for you. I want to take care of you. I want to give you these gifts, right? I want to do this for you. This is what I think is so interesting, that nowhere in Abraham's life, in any of the verses in the chapters, do we ever see God ever chastise Abraham in any way. His interaction with God is always one of care, of love, of all of this, that God is caring for him like a father. Right now, what's interesting about this is it says so he's taken his family members with him, and what we see in chapter 13 is that God has been faithful to part of his promise to prosper those who are with Abraham, and Lot and Abram's flocks have grown so much that their herdsmen are fighting amongst themselves for the resources of the area. And so what we see is that they decide that they're going to separate, right? But what we see is that with Lot, the promise that God had said about blessing those who bless Abram has come true. So they're looking out over the land, and where does Lot choose? He's going to take that really great
Green
pasture
part,
land
yeah.
down there by what two places?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So he's going to take the land in the Jordan Valley over there by Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's interesting, even at that point in time, Sodom and Gomorrah has a notorious reputation, right? Now, after they separate, God comes back to Abraham, and he tells him that he's greatly going to prosper him, that he tells Abram to walk around all of the land, that he can see that everything that Abram will set his foot to will be his, right? And that he's promised him this entire land. Now, when we get to chapter 14, what's an interesting thing that happens there is that as Lot we're kind of told some of the political things that are happening in Canaan at that time. What we see is that there are 5 Mesopotamian kings who have created a federation, and they've come over from Mesopotamia, and they are making all of the little city kingdoms in Canaan vassal states to them, right? They've kind of enslaved them in a sense, but basically they're just mostly gathering tribute and resources and things like that from them. Well, the Canaanite kings, the kings of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, another one king, they have a whole federation of Canaanite kings who decide they're gonna rebel against the Mesopotamian kings, right? Now, these Mesopotamian kings have been ruling over them for 13 years, right? So this is this is something that's been going on for quite a while. And so the Canaanite kings rebel, they mass this army, they do all of the kind of thing, but it fails miserably, right? So much so that anyone who survives, they're living in the caves. We're told that there are tar pits in the area, the part of the soldiers fall into the tar pits. They do all of this kind of thing. So it's a horrible, horrible campaign. And in the midst of this, Lot and his family, along with survivors from the battle from Sodom and Gomorrah, they're taken by the Mesopotamian kings, and they're going to be taken back to Mesopotamia. And someone comes and he tells Abram, they tell Abram that your relative Lot has been carried off as a captive of war, and he's on his way to Mesopotamia. Now, what's interesting about this is that Abram he's kind of living in this place called the Oaks of Mamre, right? And at the Oaks of Mamre, there are some other clans that are living there, and Abram has made covenants with these other clans because these other clans see how Abraham is prospering, and so they want to go into covenants with Abraham so that they're enjoying all of that. Remember, those who bless you, I will bless. They want to get in on that. And so when this person comes in and says, hey, Lot's been carried off, his family, all of his stuff, Abraham invokes his covenant partners, and they go after the Mesopotamian kings to get Lot and the people back. Now, what is so interesting about this is he gathers about 300 some odd men with him, and they go and they wage war against those Mesopotamian kings, and guess who wins? Abraham does. Abraham is able to do with this group of just clansmen what the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain couldn't even do. And they get a lot back, they get the stuff back, they get all of the women back, the children back, they get the food back, they get everything back, and Abram brings it back to the valley there where Sodom and Gomorrah is and all of these kind of things. Now, what's unique about this though, is that this is when Abraham meets someone that is totally out of left field. When he comes back, he meets the king of what is known now as modern day Jerusalem. Yes, the king of Salem, but it's Salom, Jerusalem, right? And he meets the king, but this king is not only a king, but he is also a priest of El Elyon, the Most High God. Now, guess who it is that Abraham's worshiping? El Elyon. And so we have this interaction between Abraham and this king priest, right? And what we see is that Abraham responds in a way that he realizes that when he's talking to Melchizedek and when he's brought before Melchizedek, he is in the presence of someone who is greater than he is, right? And you see that he understands that because the text tells us that he gives Melchizedek 1/10 of the spoils that they have collected. Right now, we're going to talk more about Melchizedek next week, but what I want you to see is that when you read through the Genesis 14 account, does the account read as though Melchizedek is a real person?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And because there are some verses in chapter 7 that are gonna make you go, without beginning, without end, without father, without mother, what's the author talking about, right? But all of those identifying remarks are made about Melchizedek as a person that what you basically see in the narrative is he floats in with this event with Abraham, and he floats out. You don't hear anything else about Melchizedek until we get to Hebrews chapter 7. Now, but what we see is that when Abraham meets him, he is an already established king. He is an already established priest. And if the word priest is being applied to Melchizedek in Genesis 14, what do we know about priests? Remember, we defined the word priest a couple of weeks ago. What do priests do?
They mediate between God and man.
They mediate between God and man, right? So they mediate for people before God, and they mediate on God's part to the people. So what we see here is that somehow Melchizedek has been appointed to this position by God, and Abraham doesn't even know that he's around. Right? So what we see here is that Abraham has experience with this priesthood. Right? But then that's all that's said about it. Okay? Now, after that event, in chapter 15, well, any thoughts before we move on from chapter 14? Because I want you guys to understand that, because I don't want you to get bogged down when you're looking at chapter 7 next week, trying to determine, well, was Melchizedek a real person? Was he not a real person? What does it mean that he has no father, no mother? Was he just like an apparition? Did he appeared before Abraham and then he disappeared after Abraham was gone? No. But what the author's going to do in chapter 7 is all of those things that he's telling us are part of the contrast between the Aaronic priesthood and the order of Melchizedek. Right? So, Melchizedek was a real man. He was a real king. He was a real priest. He worshipped El Elyon simultaneously at the same time that Abraham is learning about this. And it would appear that his relationship with God is much more mature than what Abraham's is. Because in chapter 15 of Genesis, after this event happens, the chapter starts with, and after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you, and your reward will be very great. The word here for reward is your compensation is going to be great, right? You're going to have a great payment coming out of this. And Abram kind of responds, okay, Lord, what can you really give me that I need? Because what I really need that you promised me are what? Descendants, an heir. And because you haven't given me an heir, what I've done is I've made Eliezer of Damascus my heir, right? I've adopted him to be my heir. Now, this was not unusual. If you were a couple and you didn't have a child, you basically had two options open to you. You could adopt someone, or you could have a surrogate produce a child for you. And that was common practice back then, right? And so Abraham's like, okay, years later, see, Abraham comes into the land at 75, and what you see is that all of these years are ticking by, right? No children. Sarah, when Abraham's 75, Sarah's 65, all of this time is ticking away, and they don't have any children. So he says, you know what, I've just made Eliezer my heir. And what does God say? No. Eleazar's not going to be your heir. And then what does God tell him about an heir? Is he going to adopt somebody else? Is it just a matter of Eliezer is the one that God wants him to adopt? He's going to have a child from his own body. Now, that's all he's told. Okay? That this child will be from his own body. And then God takes him outside, and in verse 5 of chapter 15, he says, and he took him outside and he said, now look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And God said to him, so shall your descendants be. Then Abram believed in God, and how did God respond? He reckoned it to him as righteousness. This is one of those verses you need to know this concept theologically, because the whole rest of the Bible is on this type of thing. Right? Now, what's unusual about this? Like when you look at this, why is this so amazing? When it says, and he believed God, or he trusted God. What's so amazing about that? He doesn't have any children. He doesn't have anything. And then God takes him out there and he says, you know what, your descendants are going to be as many as the stars in the sky. And how does Abraham respond to that? Even though he can't see any of that fulfillment with his physical eyes, and even though nature itself is telling him about the impossibility of this promise, what does Abraham do? He believes and he trusts God. And God takes that trust, and he then says that from that moment on, Abraham is in right standing with him. Now, righteous does not mean sinless. Okay? Because if we interpret righteous as sinless, we're going to have a huge problem with Abraham. Because he will go on from this moment and he'll do some pretty questionable things, okay? Especially regarding Sarah. So what we see though is that this is the moment that God says, you are in right standing with me. I have nothing against you now, right? And it's so interesting that right after God says that to him, Abraham has a question. And what is his question? He says, because God tells him, I'm going to give you the land, right? This land, I'm going to give you this land to possess it. And Abraham's next question to him is, how will I know that I will possess it? Now, this is kind of what the author is talking about in Hebrews. Because Abraham wants an assurance that he and his descendants are going to possess the land. And what does God give him?
Makes a covenant.
He gives him this word, but he gives him the covenant. Remember, he tells him to get the animals, he tells him to cut the animals in half, he does all of that kind of thing. And then that night, Abraham has this vision and he has this experience. And what is so interesting about this is that up until this time, you kind of see God telling Abraham things, but not very detailed, right? When Abraham places his trust in God, God starts revealing a lot more things to Abraham. Because once Abraham makes that step of trust, he and God are now in what? They're now in a relationship, right? And so God doesn't say, well, this is how you know you're going to have the land. He starts out with your descendants, right? He says you're going to die at a good old age. You're going to die in the land. You're going to do all of that kind of thing. But what's going to happen to his descendants? Are they going to be in the land forever?
They're going to possess it.
Okay, but what's going to happen to them first? They're going to be enslaved. He says they're going to be enslaved in a land for how long? 400 years. So now when God tells this to Abraham, how long is this plan going to take to play out? Hundreds of years. God is telling Abraham, you are not going to see the fulfillment of this promise. Right? But what does God say he will do with those descendants after 400 years? He will bring them back. He'll judge the nation that has enslaved them. He will bring them back to judge the people of Canaan, and he will do that. Now, That could have been enough for God to do. He could just have said that, woke Abraham up, and everything had been fine. But what step further does God do to assure Abraham of his intentions towards him? He makes the covenant. At that moment, Abraham sees the smoking torch and the firing pot, and it passes through the pieces of the flesh, God himself passing through that flesh to make a covenant with Abram. And the entire covenant is based upon whose faithfulness? God's. What does Abraham do here? Nothing. He believes. He just lays there and listens. Right? And this is what the author's talking about, that because he wanted Abraham to understand how intentional he was regarding his purpose with Abraham, that God takes it upon himself to do something that Abraham would have understood, and Abraham would have understood it as God being faithful to what he has told him. Okay? So this is a profound moment in Abraham's life when God makes his covenant with him. Now, after we have chapter, so any thoughts about that before we go on? We're good? Okay. Then we have chapter 16. Interesting thing happens in chapter 16. A child is produced, right? And given, based on the information that Abraham had been given in chapter 15, the production, when Ishmael comes along, it's not a bad thing. They're not sinning in a sense. They're not going outside of God's intended design, anything like that, because God had only told Abraham that the child would be what? His. There's no mention of who the mother of the child would be. So they decide that they'll use a surrogate. Ishmael is born out of that decision, right? So then we get to chapter 17. And it's 13 years later. And God comes to Abraham and he tells him, now I want to give you something else regarding this covenant with the land and everything. I'm going to give you the sign of circumcision. And we have the whole discussion of circumcision, and so we have this a mark that they're going to wear on themselves to remember the promise of God regarding the land. But we also see that God tells Abram and Sarai that their names are going to be changed from this moment on, from Abram to Abraham, and from Sarai to Sarah. And what God does in doing that is he takes the part of his name, Yahweh, he takes part of that name and he attaches it to Sarai and Abram. So now they share a covenant name with God. Okay? And as the chapter goes on, God brings up the discussion about the descendants. And he says, guess what? You're going to have a child of your own by Sarah. And, okay, now, at this point in time, he is close to 100. Sarah is close to 90. Right? And Isaac and Abraham laughs about this. He's like, you know, just the possibility of this. And he doesn't laugh in unbelief. It's just like, seriously? We're going to have a child now at this point? And what we see is that he tells him that he's going to have this child, and because he laughed, God's going to name the child Isaac, which means laughter. Right? And he said, and this child will be the child that all of your covenant promises, all the promises that I've made to you, will come through this child. He will be the recipient of these promises. And God says, no. What about Ishmael? Can't Ishmael be the one to have these promises? And what does God say? No. But he says, but you know what? Don't worry about Ishmael. I'm going to take great care of Ishmael. He's going to grow up. He's going to have 12 princes that come from his line. I'm going to make great nations out of Ishmael. Don't worry about it, because I'm going to fulfill that nation's promise through Ishmael. But Isaac is going to be the one through whom your descendants will be counted. Right? And then what's interesting about it, is that God says in a year from now, Sarah will have a child. Now, as we go through that, so we see that Abraham believed that, and this is what, when you look at Romans chapter 4, this is the promise that Paul says that Abraham never wavered in his trust and belief in that promise that Isaac would be born. He never doubted it. Right? But let me ask you, how is it that he never doubted it? What has been happening over all of these years between God and Abraham? The Lord spoke to him, but what are they creating? They're creating this beautiful relationship, right? And that's what's so profound when Paul brings this up, that with that promise regarding Isaac, he never wavered. Even though as he was looking at Sarah and he was looking at himself, what did he realize? We're old. Hearts don't work the same way that they used to. How are we going to raise a child at this age? You know, all the things that nature and the world would tell you, he looks at, but he doesn't waver. And then what we see a year later, who is born in chapter 21? Isaac is born. Now, the problem is that when Isaac is born, all of these things with Ishmael and Hagar start to come to the surface, and he's born, and there's all this joy, and as was custom then, when a child went from being an infant to a toddler, which was usually around 4 or 5 years old, they had a big celebration that this child had survived to this point in life, right? It was like, yay, we've kept a baby human alive. You know, so they might make it to adulthood, okay? It was a big thing that happens in chapter 21. And in the midst of this celebration, what does Ishmael decide he's going to do? He's going to tease and mock his baby brother. Now, Ishmael he was 13 when they were given the sign of circumcision. Isaac is born when he's 14. When he's weaned, it's probably 4 to 5 years later. So Ishmael is in his late teens when this happens. Right? And who gets really upset about this? Sarah does. Right? And what does she tell Abram? Get rid of that slave woman and that boy. That slave woman's son will not inherit with my son. He will not be allowed to have what is rightfully my son's. Get rid of him. And how does Abraham feel about that? Is he saddened by it? He is. It's his son, right? And he is saddened by it. He comes and he talks to God. And what does God say? Listen to Sarah, right? Do what Sarah tells you to do. Now, remember though, what had God already told Abraham about Ishmael? Will he survive to adulthood and have children of his own? Yes, he will, right? So he doesn't really need to worry about Ishmael when he sends him out. But what you see here is that now once Ishmael is gone, Isaac is the focus of the family. Like, this kid is precious, right? Then we get to chapter 22, right? And this is the chapter where our verse in Hebrews is taken from. Now, in chapter 22, how does chapter 22 start? God tested Abraham. Now, one of the things that we always need to remember when we see phrases like that is that God never tests anyone for them to fail. The purpose of a test is to prove something within that person, right? Now, what is the test? Take who? Isaac. And it's interesting how God kind of inserts them. It says, take Isaac, your only son whom you love.
First mention.
Okay? And go and do what?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice him as a burnt offering. right? And a burnt offering is a worship offering, right? Now, once again, I mean, have you seen all of these places where Abram could have chosen not to believe God? But what do we see is always the choice that Abraham makes. He always chooses to believe, right? And so what does Abraham get up the next morning and do? He gets up early, takes a couple of the young men from his household and his son, who by now, like when you read this account, how old do you see Isaac in your mind?
He's gotta be a teenager.
Yeah, he's not, you know, a lot of times in storybooks, they make him like this little, like, 5 or 6 year old, you know, but he's not. He's in his teens, probably his late teens. The same word that is used for young men in the Hebrew, that when it talks about, and he took the lad, it's the same word. So it's not that he's a little boy, because they go and they get 3 days away from Moriah, where they're supposed to go and make the sacrifice. And Isaac and Abraham take off to go where they're going to sacrifice. And who's carrying all the wood for the sacrifice? Isaac is. And you know what? It doesn't take just like a few twigs to burn a sacrifice, right? And as they're getting closer, as they're walking, Isaac knows enough about sacrificing and what is needed to sacrifice that he kind of asks his dad about something very serious that they need, that they're missing, and that's what? Where's the sacrifice? Now remember, the word sacrifice means victim, right? So when you sacrifice a sheep, the sheep is the victim of that. And so Isaac's looking around and going, well, where's the thing we're going to sacrifice? And what does Abraham say to him? The Lord will provide, right? Now, they get up there to the mountain, the whole thing, they build the altar, they put the wood on the altar. I believe Isaac climbs up on that altar, because Abraham is in his hundreds now, 100 and some odd years old. It says something, I think, about Isaac's faith. He gets on that altar, and what is Abraham poised and ready to do? Sacrifice Isaac. And then who shows up and says what? The Lord shows up and he says, don't sacrifice him. Now I know, basically to paraphrase it, now I know that I'm the most important thing in your life. And that's what God tells him. And then we have this verse after that incident that we see in Hebrews chapter 6. So it says, after all of that, in verse 26, it says, hold on just a second. He says, in verse 26 and verse 13, it says, then Abram raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abram went and he took the ram and he offered him up for a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn. This is the verse that the author gives us in Hebrews 6. He says, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven, as the sands which are on the seashore. You and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Right? So, how does the author take then all of this information? Now, it's interesting because he doesn't remind them in chapter 6 of any of these things regarding Abraham. He just says, what about Abraham? Okay, he says, in verse 12, he says, so you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. For when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you. So having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. Now, what is assumed in those verses?
That you know what the promise was?
They know what the promise was, they know the story behind the promises, they know all of the narrative of Abraham's life. And that whole narrative of Abraham's life is a life lived in what? Obedience, trust, and perseverance. How long did they wait for Isaac? He was 100 years old. He came into Canaan when he was 75 years old. He was in that land for 25 years before Isaac was born. You know what? He will wait another 60 years before he will see Isaac's children born. And then when Isaac's children are born, Isaac only has 2. See, so, but what is the point that the author is talking about here in regards to this perseverance and hope? If we have to wait and we have to be patient for God to do what he says he's going to do, does it say something about God? Is God not trustworthy? Is he not one that we can have confidence in that he's going to do what he says he's going to do? Is that what we learn from the life of Abraham? He is trustworthy. And we can have confidence in whatever God tells us. Just as Abraham had that confidence, we can have that confidence. And that's what he goes on to talk about with the hope, right? And if we understand that the hope isn't just a wish, or just like, well, it might happen, it might not happen, but a hope is a confident expectation. Now, I may not know when it's going to happen, but I know that it will happen, right? And so the author goes on and he says, and this hope, right? Well, let's go back to verse 18. He says, so that by 2 unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, what are the 2 unchangeable things?
He doesn't lie and he doesn't change.
Right, but what were the 2 things that were given to Abraham for God to reassure him that he wasn't going to change and that he wasn't lying? The promise and the oath. Right? Once God spoke those, they were unchangeable. Whatever God had bound himself by with the oath could never be changed. The terms of the gift that he was giving to Abraham would never be changed. Those were the 2 unchangeable things. Right? And Abraham understood that God could not lie. It is impossible for God to lie. Now, this is where I think it ties back to verses 4 through 8. Because he says, we who have taken refuge have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. Now, when you read the word refuge, what does that imply to you? Okay, see, Jerry, I was like you. I thought, well, this is hiding. So when he says once we're hiding, we have this hope. That's not what the word means in the Greek. The word refuge in the Greek means to run away. It means to flee away from something. Okay? So now what have those believers fled away from? And when they fled away from that, what would they have strong encouragement? What were they supposed to take hold of? Now think back to 4 through 8. What had some of them done? They'd slidden back into what? Judaism, right? When they had come to Christ, though, what had they fled from? Judaism. They'd run away from it, right? And now he says that we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. And who is that hope set before them? Christ. Everything that the author has said about Christ. And this is this idea, and what the hope is that Christ is able to do for them what they've been told that he can do. And this is what the author goes on and he says, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil. Now, what is the veil? Okay, now, the minute that the word veil is inserted into this discussion, as a Jew, where would their minds have gone?
To the temple.
To the tabernacle and the temple. Because what separated the holy place and the Holy of Holies?
The veil.
The veil. Right? So the author says that our hope goes through this veil because who has gone through the veil before us?
Jesus.
Jesus has, right? So he says this hope that we have is an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So now he's taken this detour. He comes back now to who he wanted to explain to them at the end of chapter 4 and at the beginning of chapter 5. So now he's hoping that he's given them enough information that when he starts talking about Melchizedek, what discussion are they going to be able to track with now? Is the discussion of the different orders of priests. But what's so beautiful about this, when it says that Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, that he's gone through that veil for us, how do you see that in your mind? Because you know what, it's really good for us to stop at moments like that and think about, what does that actually mean? In regards to knowing what they knew about who could go through that veil, who couldn't go through that veil, what is the author telling them about Jesus? He's a high priest, but what's so interesting is he is not a high priest that cuts off access. He's a high priest who stands there, pushing the veil aside and telling everyone to do what? Come on in. Come on in. And this is what's so profound about this. This is why the author goes on in chapter 7 and he says, now regarding Melchizedek, and he gives us all of that information about Melchizedek, but then he makes the case that if Christ is going to be who he says he is, he cannot be in the line of Aaron, because the line of Aaron is tied to the law, and the law cannot make us righteous.
And everybody in Aaron's priesthood died, but Jesus.
And everyone in priesthood died. This is a really important point about the Melchizedek priesthood, is that Melchizedek, even though he died, he retained the title of priest. With Aaron, before he died, who was given the title of priest? His son. So Aaron didn't die ever holding the title of priest any longer. And from generation to generation, because of the age limit that was placed on the high priest, none of them ever died retaining the title of high priest. But Melchizedek did. Right? And this is what this whole discussion is this idea of how is it that Jesus can push back that veil and invite everybody in, because that's something that the Aaronic priesthood could never do. Right? And so, I mean, we're going to talk about chapter 7 and 8 next week, but you know what is so beautiful about this is at the end of, in verse 18 of chapter 7. The author says, for on the one hand, there is a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and its uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect, and on the other hand, there is a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God, inasmuch as that hope was not without an oath. For they indeed became priests without an oath, but Jesus with an oath. through the one who said to him, "The Lord has sworn, and will not change his mind. You are a priest for how long? Forever." Now, do you know what? We read that, and I think it's really interesting because the author says that that verse is an oath given to Jesus. Right? So, what is the Father promising Jesus forever? Yes, and what does that mean? He's the ultimate mediator, and how long will he be able to mediate? Forever. And I think this is so beautiful that God promises Jesus, you know what? You will be able to mediate on their behalf forever. The work that you do for them will be forever. You can bring them to me through the veil for how long? Forever. I promise you that. It's an oath between the Father and the Son. Isn't that profound? That God doesn't have to bind himself with that oath. Why do you think the oath is given? Do you think it's because Jesus doesn't trust the Father, or do you think it's on for our behalf years and years and years later when we're thinking about the work of Christ? It's for us. Because once God swore that oath to Jesus, how do I play into that? How does humanity play into that? From the time this oath is sworn, humanity has a way of redemption that will never be taken away from them. But it's found only in the person and work of who? Christ. It's an oath sworn to him, but in a sense, a promise that's made to us. Isn't that beautiful? That it will never run out. Chris.
I just saw the connection between that and verse 40 of chapter 11, because he's talking about all these people who had died, and he says, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us. That apart from us, they should not be made perfect. So he's taken this into the future.
Into the future. And that's what's so beautiful about it. And it's not just something that the author just throws in there, oh, in case you wanted just a point of reference, here's a verse, that you can do. No, he specifically talks about this verse as an oath given to Christ about the eternalness of his priesthood. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at chapter 8 and 7 and parts of chapter 6, and we're going to tie all of this priesthood discussion together. Okay? So, any thoughts before we close? Prayer? Are we good? We're good? Well, at least maybe if we're not good, do you have enough to chew on? Okay, always. Okay. All right. Well then, let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for this time that we were able to spend in your word. And Father, I just ask that you would just help us as we process this and think about it, that we would just come to your word and we would meditate upon it, and as we do, that all of these dots would be connected, and we would truly have a clearer picture of what the author is trying to tell those people, and that in having a clearer picture, that we would have a clearer understanding of the work that you have given to us through your Son. And so I just ask that you would just bless everyone who's here tonight, that you would just, their time in your word would just be a wonderful time that they have this week, that it just would be as sweet to their lips as honey. And that, Father, that if it's your will, that we would come back next week and we would continue to discuss this. So Father, I just ask that you would watch over them all as they go home, that you would take them home safely, and that you would bring us back again next week to continue. And we thank you for all of this in your Son's precious name. Amen.